Welcome back to the Age to Age podcast, conversations that bridge one generation to the next. Normally on this show, you're hearing directly from somebody who lived it, sitting across from me, telling me in their own words what life looked like in their own time. This episode, as with the previous couple, is a little different. And this is our third in a historical strand. These are episodes that are built entirely from the record, biographies, archives, and in some cases recorded interviews and even families' testimonies. Every word you're about to hear either comes directly from my guest or is built carefully from what's actually documented about their lives. There's nothing invented and there's nothing that's dramatized beyond what the record actually allows. On today's episode, my guest is Hubert Adedeji Ogunde. Now, if you don't know the name, I'm sure you probably know his shadow. He's known as the father of Nigerian theatre, and a man who took a hymn from his father's church and a masquerade from his mother's village and built an entire touring nation out of both. For 46 years, he was banned twice, arrested more than once, and by his own account, he never once let a problem stop him. This is Hubert Ogunde, and on with the podcast. Jos, 1946. We are mid-performance. Strike and Hunger, my play about the strike the workers held the year before. The one the whole country was still talking about. And the hall was full. And then suddenly the doors went. And it wasn't latecomers. It's the police. I remember standing there on my own stage, in my own play, watching men in uniform come down the aisle toward me and thinking that this must be a dream. It has to be a dream. But I didn't wake up. They scattered my actors, they scattered my audience, they fined me £125 for a play. And then something happened that I couldn't have arranged even if I tried. The newspapers took it up. There was screeching headlines. It became a public argument that ran for days. Their darling, captured by the colonial masters. I didn't go looking for that fight. But once it found me, I understood exactly what I actually did for a living. And it wasn't theatre. It wasn't entertainment. I told people what they already knew, out loud in a room together. And it turned out that was one of the more dangerous things a man could do in his own country. It also turned out to be the best advertising that I never paid for. And so I did it for 46 more years. My name is Hubert Adedeji Ogunde. Some of you will know me as Chief, some of you only as the name on the record sleeve or over a theatre hall, or a name your grandmother said, the way people say names that they're proud of. Well, I was born on the 10th of July 1916 in Ososa, Jebu Country, what is now Ogun State. A small town, everyone in the town knew whose son I was before they even knew my name. My father was a Baptist missionary. Actually, he became a pastor. He was a churchman, an organist, and a good disciplinarian. And my mother's side of the house was a different kind of devotion altogether. My grandfather was an Ifa priest. My grandmother, too, she was an idol worshipper. And in our house, we had several idols. And as you can imagine, there were ritual ceremonies taking place every day. So 2 altars in one compound, and I was raised inside both. And I never once heard anyone in that house treat it as a contradiction, which is probably why I never did either. And so if I bring all of that together, I will say I'm a Christian and I'm also a traditional religious man. It's the same thing, really. In Christianity, they say do unto others as you wish them to do unto you. And that is my belief. I had 7 years of schooling across 3 schools. And when an opportunity came for me to go to, one of those desirable universities or colleges, in hindsight, I have to say, I thank God that I didn't end up going, to those. Not because I, scorned learning, but because outside those school doors in that same small town, something was beginning to happen to me. I watched the Alarinjo Masquerade Theatre pass through. The old traveling kind, older, much older than me, in fact, older than my father, older than anyone in that compound. And at that time, nobody sat me down and told me that I would spend the rest of my life turning an old song and a masquerade into the same art form. I just grew up somewhere where both things were already true. And some part of me, I guess, never saw the point in choosing one from the other. For a few years, I was exactly what my father wanted. I was a school teacher. In fact, I was a church organist, the band organizer, very steady, respectable. And then, by pure accident, I became a policeman. I was on holiday in Ibadan, and I think I saw a crowd of people, many people standing, and I asked them what they were doing there, and they said policemen were being recruited. So I said, but policeman, that sounds good. I like that. And so I joined the queue, and maybe about 10 minutes later, the superintendent came out and said, line up. And there were over 400 of us on this parade. And he looked around and picked 40 of us out of the 400. And so we sat in examination, and 4 of us were selected. And that's how I joined the police. I didn't plan to become a colonial constable that morning. I planned to watch a crowd, and that was, 1941. It was while I was still in that uniform that I wrote my first opera, The Garden of Eden and the Throne of God. That was in June 1944. Glover Memorial Hall, Lagos, The church paid for it to raise money for a building fund. And Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe himself sat in that audience. Over 1,000 people came. It wasn't long after that I resigned the force and started the company almost on nothing. The whole money that I had at that time was about £9. That was my entire savings, years of it from being in the police. And out of those £9, I bought raffia, I bought drums, I bought a small bicycle for £1.10 and some costumes. And obviously I needed women for the company. And Lagos, as it turns out, they didn't want to give me any. I put out an advert in the press asking for 30 charming ladies as actresses. 30. And yeah, I got no response. So I put out another ad. I said, wanted 30 lady clerks as workers. And this time the response was tremendous. It was incredible. Many girls came, even boys came. But when they arrived for the interviews and I told them I actually wanted them as actresses, many of them ran away. and some were, removed by their parents who didn't want their girls appearing on stage, and being taken for prostitutes. Because at that time, that was kind of it was assumed of stage women, that they were prostitutes. And that part, I don't want to take away from that part, because I built something that went on to feed many great families, mine included. And in those years, in the first years especially, I built it despite the objections of fathers who had a good reason to worry what a stage would do to their daughters' names. But when you're building something, that's not the kind of thing you worry about. So 4th of March, 1946, Tiger's Empire, that's the night that I would call the real beginning, if you ask me, because on stage there were women paid because, they were artists in their own right. And that's the nights that that's the dates that I'd put down as the real beginning. Not long after that, I took Strike and Hunger to Jos. And you've already heard, how that ended. But what I didn't tell you at the start is what came after the fine. So that story ran in every nationalist paper in the country. Days of arguments. My name attached to colonial injustice in every household. Now, I didn't plan that. In fact, I would not have dared plan that. But once it happened, I understood something about my own country that never left me. They could find me, but they could not untell the story that I was telling. So 1964, my play, Yoruba Ronu, which means Yoruba Think. The ruling party of my own region, they invited me to write something for the opening of their cultural wing. And they thought I was going to, show a nice cultural show of Yoruba custom. And through my play, I started attacking them. I dressed a life political betrayal in old clothes. There was a king, a deputy left in charge who decides not to give the throne back, and the whole land was gone to corruption while he was holding it. And everyone in the hall knew exactly whose face belonged under that story. The premier and the ministers realized I was attacking them, and they all got up and walked out. But I didn't stop the play. We saw it through. We finished it in front of everybody that remained. And the audience that stayed, they loved every minute of it. And of course, a few days later, we were banned. the whole western region was closed to my company. In that moment, however, I didn't run to the newspapers. I didn't even need to. It was the press. They protested on our behalf. But for 2 years, the ban held for 2 years, right up until a coup. The violent one. Men were killed. The government was pulled down by force, and not by any vote or any play of mine. And the new administration, they lifted the ban. People have called it vindication ever since then. And, I understand the impulse, but I won't stand here and tell you that my play predicted a coup. All I did through the play was we named a fracture that was already there. And history, in its own ugly way, proved that the fracture was real. That's not prophecy. That's what happens when a true thing is said, in front of the wrong people, of course, but the room remembers it. And then, the thing that was said comes true. When my company toured Britain in 1969, the English papers had already decided what a household like mine should look like. They called it a scandal when they were feeling unkind. And, I didn't spend much time correcting them line by line. But when the BBC actually asked me, I told them, because people always ask me, more than anything else in those days, how many wives do I have? How many children? And the truth is, it isn't a number, because traditionally, Africans, we don't count the number of wives. We know we have wives. There may be 5, maybe 10. My grandfather had more than 20. But usually, it's a secret to the household. So I will just tell you, there are more than 10. And that's what I would tell you. And the children, it's forbidden to count. You're not allowed by tradition to say, I have 4 children, or 15, or 20. You just say, I have children. And when they want to know why, why build a life this way, with the whole of Europe watching and waiting to disapprove, I just say, it works better than the white man's arrangement, because here, it's a community. This house, for example, is a community. I'm the head. These are the women. These are the children. And we all have everything in common. The work I do is the work that they do too. And when you have that many hands working, many hearts devoted toward one particular goal, 2 heads are better than 1, that's what they say. And I think that's better than, only one man thinking about everything on his own. And so there are, will there be some petty jealousies? And in a community like this, maybe, but they're not pronounced enough to damage anything. If there's a quarrel, it is settled, and people live together like brothers and sisters. And that's something that I like very much. It's our own life. So when you hear later on that I had 17 wives, 24 children, I think now you can understand what you're actually hearing. And, I did lose one of them in a way I've never fully finished grieving. Adeshewa, Mamaiko, that's what they called her. My frontline woman, always beside me. We were supposed to go to Ilesha to perform, and they went ahead of me, and the lorry they were traveling in had an accident, and she died. People even thought that I wouldn't be able to survive it. They thought I wouldn't be able to continue. But I have a goal. I have a mission to fulfill. If the death of this madame could stop the whole mission, it means it was no mission at all. And a company that size does not just pause. I think we had some kind of strength. And whatever else was true of our household, it ran on more than affection. I believe, because we think everything has been prearranged by God. So I now know that because of what I am to do in this life, my wives and my children have been specially provided to be my assistants. And I had more hands than most men, and I used every one of them in the mission. If you want to know the sum of what I believed, it's this, that in any venture, there must be problems. There must be difficulties. And then one has to persevere in spite of all the odds. I think this has been the reason why I have been able to be as successful. Because in my life, problems don't set me back. When I meet any problem, what I do is just ignore it and push forward. The woman who studied my life more carefully than almost anybody, Ebon Clark, she said, the greatest thing that I did wasn't invention. I mean, there was already theatre in the land long before I was born. But what I did, and this is what she said, was I engaged the direction of Yoruba theatre and gave it a new movement, new motion, new dimension, new scale and range. A man who redirects a river doesn't get to claim that he made the water, but he does get to say where it goes next. And where I sent it again and again was towards the powers that be, and towards the culture of my time. Regret? What do I regret? Even near the end, I wouldn't hand my work to just anyone's care. When Aye was running at the National Theatre and I disagreed with the management over the split of the money, I went to the projection box and I removed my film. There was a riot in the theatre that night, and I make no apology for that. I had spent my whole life being told, especially by the colonial government, by a regional premier, by cinema managements, what my own work was worth and who got to decide it. So I stopped asking. Actually, I stopped asking a long time before that night. And near the very end, I was in the north, filming a small role in a picture called Mr. Johnson. I fell ill on that job, and they flew me to London to a hospital, and I asked to go back for, just 2 more days to finish what I'd been paid to finish. And so they chartered a plane, I finished the part, and then I went back to London, and I wasn't getting better. And so I died in the early hours of a Wednesday, the 4th of April, in 1990, in Cromwell Hospital in London. I was 73 years old. Not long before the end, I had gone to, back home to Ososa. And I stood at the shrine that my grandfather had built, over 100 years before, where he used to sit and divine for people who traveled some 50, 100, even as far as 200 miles just to reach him. Standing there, I didn't realize that my own family would one day build me a resting place shaped like the very instruments that my grandfather used at the shrine. And Okmohifa, a divination tray, raised over my own grave in that same town. Now, I didn't choose that, they did. But I think of every honor that anyone has ever tried to give me since, that's the one that actually understood who I was. A man who never fully chose between the hymn and the ritual, lay to rest in the end under the ritual's own shape. They turned my house into a museum. My bedroom was left, the way I left it. My records, my costumes, the lorry that I used to haul a company and its whole world, from town to town. And even more recently, they began translating my old songs and operas out of Yoruba. So the grandchildren of the people who first heard them, many of whom don't speak the language the way their grandparents did, so that they could actually hear what I was saying. So you've asked me for one piece of advice. Problems don't set you back. When you meet one, you don't wait for permission. You just keep going. You push forward. And I also want to say that it's important to use your creativity to offer the world the truth. Say the true thing to a room full of people. And let history sort out, the understanding much later, sometimes even after you've been long gone. So, I have served my time. I only hope that the future, with all its innovations and technologies, has advanced and taken what we have started and taken it beyond any of us could have ever imagined. That's the way the world goes, Thank you for having me on.
I write the story of what is happening in the society. That's how I believe it. It may be social, may be religious, may be folkloric, and may be political, if you like. But to me, the theater is to reflect the age of the society. This is our life.
Hubert Ogunde spent his whole life refusing to give anyone a number for how large his family actually was. I don't think it was a secret for the sake of it. I think it was his custom, and it was a door that he chose to leave shut. Now, his family opened it after he was gone, and there was a record of 17 wives, 24 children, and a household that ran his theatre, his box office, his recording business, his whole touring life. And he stood once at his grandfather's shrine and said that it would never lie down until everyone who remembered it was gone. His own family has made sure that that never happened to him either. Now, he was a man that was devoted to saying the true thing, and he strived in his life, you could tell from the records, to say the true thing in his movies, in his plays, and in his music, and for 80 years that has survived. For me, that's just a remarkable man by any stretch of the imagination. And it's been my pleasure to have Hubert Ogunde on the podcast. And if this one landed for you, why don't you share it with somebody? And if you haven't already, follow the show wherever you get your podcasts or your, YouTube, so that the next one can find you. And I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Midday.